Hello everyone, this is Brent Horton, student of Cal Baptist University, class KIN332, and today I'd like to go over with you the gait development across a lifespan. So just kind of an overview of what the gait is, in particular the gait cycle. So with the gait cycle we see first there's the stance phase, and as well as the swing phase. The stance phase accounts for about 60% of the total gait cycle, whereas the swing phase accounts for about 40%. With the stance phase, we see first the initial contact and loading response, which takes place with the heel strike and weight shifted onto the leg, as you can see here. Mid stance is when the femur is perpendicular to the ground, so if you can see here. And the terminal stance is when you have a heel off hip extension, and it's just before pre-swing here. With the swing phase, as I said, it counts for 40%. And we first see the initial swing, which is the toe off, and just before hip flexion and occurs. Basically, you see it here in the pre-swing with the toe off. And mid-swing, we see a leg at the midline of the body as the leg prepares for knee extension. And finally, terminal swing, we see maximal hip and knee extension, and it's just prior to the initial contact, which we see again in the beginning. And just some other terms, we have a base of support, which I have a little picture here showing. It's just basically the supporting surface beneath a person's feet, so basically the distance between the 2 feet, and the area, circumference area between the feet. And we have stride length, which is basically the distance between the 2 feet in gait. And we have the arm swing, which is the contralateral swinging of the arms to that of the footsteps in the gait. So just real quickly, some theories and principles relating to motor pattern development. The first one was Newell's model, and that was by Carl Newell, who is a theorist who suggests that movements arise from the interaction of the organism, the environment, and the task together. And from all these interactions of all these different modalities, movement can emerge. And then we have the maturational model, which developmentalists say that changes occur due to the central nervous system, and that the central nervous system basically dictates motor development. And then we have information processing perspective, which is basically like the brain as a computer, and that we have an input of some kind of input information, and then the processing of that information, and then an output response, which is human movement in response to that task. And then we have a ecological perspective, which emphasizes the relationship of all three, similar to Newell's model. The only difference is basically that one system can be dominant, although all systems should be considered when determining motor development. So first, looking at early childhood, this is from birth to approximately about 7 months old. We see fundamental skills that are developing amongst the infant and toddler, and these are they must be acquired before walking can be developed. So prior to walking, 2 key milestones are needed, and the first one is crawling, which is it's when the baby or toddler is on their hands and stomach. And the infant first needs muscular strength in the neck and shoulders to allow for the head to be up when laying on the belly. And creeping is the second key milestone, which is the hands and knees, as you can see this little guy here. And this is crawling down here. And the third, which is questionable, but it's called a quadruple gait or quadruped, and it's hands and feet. And it's interesting because I actually saw a documentary. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It was featured on BBC and several other, but it's basically a documentary stating that there's a family that walks on all fours, and there's even scientists that of the evolutionary theory stating that, oh, perhaps they can give us some kind of a clue to our primitive ancestry and so on and so forth. What I don't believe at all, of course, but what I think really happened here is there was a lack of motor development. And so, and of course, there was environmental constraints. As you can see here, there's really not a place to. I think they were a poor family in a rural area and such, and so they had gravel and such. So, being on the knees probably wasn't as comfortable. So that's a really interesting documentary. If any of you guys are interested in checking that out, I would highly recommend it. And then other key milestones prior to walking would be sitting upright by themselves, standing and holding on to something or someone, and yeah, of course, balance and strength is needed for sufficient balance and supporting their bodies. Okay, so then we get on to walking. So we have, with the base of support, toddlers lack both coordination and overall balance. Thus, there's usually a wider base of support. And generally accompanying with that wider base of support is a toe out. Although toe in can also be seen, but it's generally the toes go outward. We also see with stride length, we see that they're usually shorter in length versus the adult, and lacking, of course, rhythm and coordination, and that's just due to lack of coordination and neurodevelopment. We also see with the arm swings a lack of contralateral arm-leg movement as seen with the adult. And according to the text, this is a common position for the arms in a mid, low, I would say more mid-high guard position, as you can see with the picture here, the baby in high guard position with the hands up by the chest area. Moving on to constraints, there could be task constraints such as perhaps it's just there's a task at hand that the toddler or infant cannot do due to lack of balance or strength or coordination. There could be structural, physical constraints as well, such as leg length, discrepancies, height and muscle mass. Environmental constraints, floor surfaces, for instance, could be a constraint for some, if the surfaces are wet or slippery. Individual constraints, and of course every toddler or infant, there's quite a big difference in the rate of development among the age groups, but neuromuscular strength, balance, coordination are often not developed at this point, so that's usually a constraint for many. And then of course experience, lacking experience could be a constraint. Cultural constraints, we see, especially in America, it's called first child syndrome, and that's basically just what the mother, as their first child, they become very attached and they like to hold the baby, and they actually prevent them from being on their stomachs. So that could be playing into as a constraint as well. And then abnormalities we see, although not too common, we do see rickets, which is a nutritional deficiency, I think, with vitamin D. We also see sometimes bowing of the knees, genu varum, or like we see here. So it's the knees are outside of the ankles. And then we have the valgus, typically is the knees in relationship to the hips. The knees are collapsed inward. Moving on to childhood, we see a glimpse of a pattern of that of an adult. And by age 4, they have achieved the developmental milestones to walk as proficient as an adult in many cases. The base of support is definitely reduced compared to that of a toddler, and the toeing out has been brought in and not toeing out anymore. Stride length we see is shorter than that of an adult. Although depending on the age, there could be steps that are shorter while others are longer. It's kind of sporadic. And then arm swing, we see a unequal, sometimes irregular arm swinging. Not as coordinated as you see with the adults with the contralateral arm-leg swing, but it is improving. And some constraints that we see, we usually see with the individual constraints, such as balance. Balance performance improves in children as they learn to rely more on kinesthetic information instead of visual information for balance. And abnormalities, typically we see, not too common, but it does happen. We see with cerebral palsy, which is a neuromuscular disease that can characterize as a diplegic gait, which can't really see with this child here, although he does have cerebral palsy. But usually they'll be on their toes and more of a flexion at the elbow, and it's a static flexion with the arm flexors. Moving on to the adult, we could see that all cycles of the gait are easily recognizable and distinguishable. We see with the base of support, it's narrowing compared to that of the toddler, and a rather stable support. With the stride length, we see longer foot strides and rhythmic in nature, and this is all due to, of course, experience and neuromuscular proficiency. With arm swing, we see that it's occurring also rhythmic and sequenced in a manner that alternates with each leg stride, so the contralateral arm swing. With adult constraints, there could be various and many, but just a few here. Environmental constraints could be the workplace, such as sitting at the desk too long. You have the rounding of the shoulders, and of course looking down at computers and phones could cause some deviation, some postural issues, and of course affect gait. We have individual constraints such as disuse, such as lack of exercise, or again working too long hours and not getting up and using muscles. We could see pain, lower back pain, knee, hip pain, even early signs of arthritis, or osteoarthritis or osteoporosis. Weight gain or weight loss could also affect lean muscle mass and gait as well. Abnormalities, we could see many and varied, but leg length discrepancy, abnormal weight shift due to pain. We could also see muscular imbalances and weaknesses, and one common one is the Trendelenburg sign, which you see here in this picture. This is the normal squared away hips, and you can see they're squared in alignment, both sides. But with the Trendelenburg sign, we see that there is a hip drop due to a weak gluteus medius and minimus. So if they're dropping to the left, for instance, it's usually due to a weakness on the right side of the glute. We can also see with stroke victims a hemiplegic gait, and that could be something very common. Okay, moving on to older adults. So from adulthood to older adults, we see a qualitative regression in most cases of all phases of the gait cycle. So we begin to see with the base of support a greater toeing out and a wider base, as we saw with the toddler. The stride lengths become shortened, and again, like the toddler, they become uncoordinated and also lacking hip-knee flexion during the swing phase. As we saw with the video, shuffling of the feet is common, just an unsteady gait. With arm swing, we see a cautious gait with arms usually at the side or hanging onto something or someone for support. And with the constraints, we see there are various and many with older adults. Changes in gait from adult to older adulthoods are most attributed to individual constraints, and it varies among individuals, and it's not universal. Individual constraints could be like sensory, so they typically will lose their hearing and eyesight, and will have perceptual changes because of it. Often they're lacking in reaction time, proprioception, balance, strength, coordination, power, flexibility, and so on. Generally, older folks have a fear of falling as well due to a prior fall, and it's actually a leading cause of accidental death over the age of 75. And fear of falling can really affect someone's gait pattern because they often don't get out enough and they lose muscular strength and flexibility, and they just have that general fear, so they have that neurological connection there. And then reliance of others, they're generally relying on others for getting out and about, and sometimes that could be a hindrance or a constraint if they're not available. Continuing on with the constraints, we also see maybe task constraints. So if there's stairs or steps, squatting, kneeling, standing, sitting too long, so on and so forth. There could be environmental constraints such as the climate, weather, the availability of others, as we talked about, walker, cane, so depending on objects to keep upright when they walk, and floor surfaces that could be too slippery or just rocky, or it could be various surfaces that are too hard for the older person to walk on. And then there could be structural constraints, so they typically will have more rigid body posture, lack of flexibility, and also body weight and body height could be a constraint if they're overweight or underweight, like we said. And osteoporosis, osteoarthritis is all too common, especially in the hip and knee. And then common abnormalities we see with the elderly is kyphosis, as you can see here with this older gentleman. It's a rounding of the thoracic spine, and it's just it's a degeneration, typically accompanied with weakness of the muscles. We can also see a antalgic gait due to pain either in the hip or knees, and they could have like a gait kind of favoring one side if they're in pain. And that's it, and my references.